It loses oxygen. So if it loses oxygen, that is what? Not oxidation. That is reduction, okay? So remember, if you lose electrons or you lose hydrogen, that's oxidation. But if you gain oxygen, that's oxidation. So remember that oxygen's like the oddball in terms of what happens. So I always think of gaining oxygen. Gaining oxygen sounds like oxidation, okay? So if oxygen goes up, it's oxidation. So which one gets oxidized? The Fe. So this is oxidized because it gains oxygen, right? So if you look at Fe and you look on the product side, it's Fe2O3. So that Fe has now gained the oxygen, and CuO ends up losing the oxygen, so it is reduced. So this is an example. Remember, this is a single displacement. So notice I have an element and a compound, and basically the compound is swapping the oxygen over to the other element.
So are you going to ask us what it is and those two things, or would you just ask for...
I mean, I could ask you, like, what kind of reaction is this, and you would have to say it's a single displacement. Or I could ask you what is reduced in this reaction, and you would have to tell me that it's CuO. Okay? Or I could ask you what's oxidized in this reaction, and you would tell me it's Fe. So there's sort of like three things in this one reaction that you should be able to identify. So the next one, what gets oxidized in this? And why? Think about what reaction it is, what kind of reaction it is. So what gets oxidized? The Al or the Br2? Or Al. Why? Because it's a metal, right? So remember that this is a synthesis reaction. So since it's a synthesis, I know it's the only examples I gave you of oxidation reduction with synthesis are metals and nonmetals. So if it's a synthesis reaction, A plus B makes C. If it's a synthesis reaction, the metal always loses electrons. So that means that bromine is reduced because it is a nonmetal, and that's going to gain electrons. Okay, notice that it's always the reactants that get identified this way, never the products. So next one, S plus H2O makes SO2 and H2. What happens to sulfur? So it is oxidized. So look at S, look on the product side, see that S is now SO2. So sulfur gains oxygen. What happens to the water then? The hydrogen of the water loses oxygen, so it is reduced. All right, next one, HCl. What happens to HCl? It loses hydrogen. So that means it is oxidized. Yeah, and part of it's just trying to make sure you keep that straight. If you lose electrons or you lose hydrogen, that's oxidation. If you gain oxygen, that's oxidation. So look at nitrogen. Nitrogen becomes NH3. So N2 becomes NH3. So do you see that nitrogen gains hydrogen? So that means it is reduced. And then what about the bottom one? So K plus N2 makes K3N2, or K3N, sorry. What happens to K? It's oxidized because it is a metal. So we know that it loses electrons. So metal and a nonmetal. So I know that the nonmetal is reduced because it gains electrons. So this one that I skipped, I'm not going to ask you this one, but in fact, when you look at this, you're like, wait, this is not a single displacement or a synthesis. It's not a combustion reaction. It doesn't really fit. But if you look at C6H12O6, what is the most similar product? The first one or the second product? So if I look at this, look on the product side, what looks the most like it? The first one or the second? The first one. Does everybody agree? So everybody agrees, like there's the carbons and hydrogens and oxygens still there. So if I'm comparing the most similar looking molecules, what happened to this? Same number of carbons, but what happens to hydrogens? It lost them. And what happened to oxygens? So both of those are examples of what? Oxidation. Okay, so do you see that this, it looks like it gains oxygen, but it also loses hydrogen. So that is oxidation. And what did I tell you about oxygen? If oxygen is a reactant, it is always reduced, always. Okay? So, rule of thumb, remember? And so it's because the oxygen provides the source of oxygen to oxidize something else. The oxygen here is actually taking on hydrogen, pulling hydrogens off of the first of the glucose molecule. And so it's acting as it's the agent that oxidizes the other thing. So it's always reduced. Oxygen's always the source of oxygen, or it's the acceptor for hydrogen. Okay? So those are ones that I just wanted to do just as to sort of finish up these. I have all hopes that things start running a little more smoothly no, never mind. They gave me my old tablet back because I griped and complained so much about it that they were like, well, we have your tablet we took away from you 3 months ago. And because they like updated, they gave me a new tablet because they had to run through like software updates and everything. And so they're like, it's easier just to swap out and give you a different tablet that's loaded with everything you need. And then we can update your tablet and we'll just deploy it to somebody else. So they brought me my old tablet back. And then she gave it to me and I was like, wait, this has like the same scratches on it that my old one had. And I was like, she goes, it is your old one. We still had it. So we just decided to update it and give it back to you. So hopefully you never call us again. So fingers crossed, things went better. It does not seem to freeze up as much. Like sometimes my pen stops working, but other than that, it doesn't seem to be causing quite as much challenge. Okay, so chapter 6. So this is the other chapter that we need to cover for exam number 3. And this is the second nutrient molecule. So this is all about carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, the name itself, carbo, think carbon, hydrate, think water. So in fact, carbohydrates, whether we're talking about the simple sugars or the huge polysaccharides, they have a ratio for every carbon. There's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, which is why it gives it that name of carbohydrate, because it sounds like carbon and water. So it's sort of the ratio that's there. Now we are really going to focus on the simple sugars and the very large starches or polysaccharides. We will mention the medium ones, but these are not really like part of your diet. These are not near as sort of common as the other 2. So if we take carbohydrates, we can split them into 2 categories. Carbohydrates are either going to be very small molecules. They call them, think of them as the simple sugars. They have that characteristic sweet taste. When they hit your taste cells, the receptors in your taste buds, this triggers that sensation of sweet. Really small. There's not much digestion that happens with simple sugars. Monosaccharides, the single sugars, do not have to get digested at all. They get absorbed. In fact, glucose can get absorbed through the lining in your mouth. So people that might have low blood sugar might actually carry little sugar packets. So if their blood sugar, they start feeling like they're getting shaky, they can actually tear open a packet, squeeze it into their mouth. Just sitting in their mouth, it'll actually get absorbed through the lining called the mucosa. That's the lining of your GI tract. So it gets absorbed quickly. This means, though, monosaccharides, disaccharides do have to have some digestion, but it doesn't take a long time. So these will have this effect of changing your blood sugar quickly. Right? So if it's absorbed quickly, doesn't take hours to digest, then you're going to have a rapid blood sugar change. So monosaccharides, single sugars, disaccharides, 2 sugars. Those 2 sugars are linked, held together by a bond. We will talk about the 4 monosaccharides and those 3 disaccharides and sort of their use, where you find them in terms of nutrients. Complex carbs, though, complex carbs are much larger. So while we're talking about 1 sugar, 2 sugars, these are hundreds or even thousands of sugars all in one big molecule. So we are talking about hundreds, go back, to thousands of sugar units per molecule. Like in one molecule, you're talking about a huge, large complex compared to the simple. So they're really very different by size. But we can take complex carbs and split them into two groups. You have the group that's digestible. They're big, but they're digestible. So starch. When you think of starch, think of anything that's flour-based. Okay? So anything that comes from a ground up grain. So pasta, potatoes, bread, rice, all of those are starchy types of foods, even corn. The majority of what's inside of corn is starch, but we can digest that. Okay? So we have enzymes that help to break this down, but because it's a huge molecule, this takes hours to digest. So it doesn't have the rapid blood sugar effect that the simple sugars have. Because in order to take something that's 500 pieces and you got to chop them all into single pieces, that's going to take time. So they tend to have a slower effect on blood sugar. Doesn't mean that they won't affect blood sugar, because ultimately they get digested to glucose. So they ultimately get digested into sugar. So that will end up affecting blood sugar. Glycogen, the other digestible molecule, is one that we actually make. Glycogen is how we store sugar for in between meals. So we'll talk a little bit about that storage polysaccharide that animals form. The non-digestible, because of the type of link between the sugars, cellulose, we don't make an enzyme to digest it. And so it's commonly called fiber. Cellulose is sort of its technical name. Well, starch is really like a common name. It's composed of a couple of things. We'll talk about those as well. But that's kind of like when you think about carbohydrates, automatically split them. Split them into the little sugars that are sweet and don't require much digestion, and the huge molecules, the polysaccharides, that if they're digestible, they're going to take a while to digest. So we're going to kind of talk about all of these. And there's topics in this. Kind of like there was in the last chapter, we talked about like combustion. So just as a hint for next week. Like if you have a short answer kind of question, combustion would be a good example of a short answer kind of question. What are the products in complete combustion? What are the products in incomplete combustion? Because we spent time talking about it. Then we also talked about alcohol detoxification. How do your liver cells, what do they do with alcohol? Okay, so you might want to go back through that. That was one of the topics. The other one was about lipids. Okay, so how you can take an oil and convert it into margarine, right? So that hydrogenation process, and why it can form trans fats, and why that's a problem. Why did they ban trans fats? So what's the challenge with those? So those are kind of like, I almost think of them as either being like real life kind of scenario applications or more health related applications. So there's a couple of things like that we're going to talk about in this chapter. One is diabetes, okay, which is like the majority of patients that you are going to have this is either the reason you're taking care of them or could be the reason like an additional challenge when you're trying to treat them. We'll also talk about sweetness, the sweetness scale, and how sweeteners differ a little bit. And then we're going to talk about fiber as well. So once we talk about cellulose, we'll talk about fiber and really its importance in the diet. So those are sort of like short answer topics that you should expect to see. Even going back to chapter 4, remember we talked about like chiral carbons. And we talked about why different drugs, if they have a chiral carbon, you have to be able to test them. So why? Like what were some of the examples that we did in class, like to talk about some of the medicines that had to be tested and have to be checked if they've got chiral carbons. Just examples for you for next time. All right, so when we're talking about mono means one, right? And the term saccharide, like you think of saccharin, an artificial sweetener. So saccharide actually means like sweet. It's the Greek term for sweet things or sugar. So these monosaccharides are the smallest. of all of them. They tend to have 6 carbons. There are some that have 5. So they name these, they call this a hexose. Hex means 6. And the OSE ending tells you it's a sugar. So when you see things like glucose, lactose, maltose, that OSE ending is a common sugar. So that tells you it's a sugar. So if I have a sugar with only 5 carbons, it would be a what? A pentose. So this would be a 5-carbon sugar. So that's one of the ways in the naming of sugars is they talk about how many carbons in the individual units. You can have 3. We don't really talk about them too much. Those would be trioses. You could have 4. Those are tetroses. But really in nature and what you ingest are either hexoses or pentoses. Those are the far and above the most common. Other things. So here is a monosaccharide. So here's glucose. Glucose is the most abundant of all of the monosaccharides. Glucose has this molecule or this functional group on the end. So when you have a carbon with the double bond oxygen to it and a hydrogen on the end, that is an aldehyde. All sugars in their straight chain form have some double bond oxygen. If it's on this end, and then whenever they draw them, they like to draw them in a straight line rather than drawing them across. You'll always see them sort of as this straight chain. So you know, and I'll take and pass this one around. So these are actually both glucoses. So notice that when you look at it, you're like, well, it's not a straight chain, okay? You can take and twist and get it so that it looks like it's sort of straight in a row. You can kind of see that, right? So you can kind of see how it's a straight chain. But so they just kind of makes it look like they flattened it out. So here's that one. So that is actually glucose. Here's another one. It's the exact same one. This one's a little more lumpy, just comparable, so it doesn't roll apart. It's just because it's from the different balls and sticks. So that is a hexose. That has, you see the aldehyde on the end. So look at the double bond oxygen that's on the end. So you would hold it so that that would always be at the top. So because it's a 6-carbon sugar, it's a hexose. Because it has an aldehyde, they call it an aldohexose. So the aldo part is because it has that aldehyde. So if you see the term aldohexose, you just know it's a 6-carbon sugar and there's going to be that aldehyde group on the end. The other thing that you can see is every single carbon other than carbon 1 has a what? What is the functional group on 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6? Every single one has an alcohol. So they call these polyalcohols. Poly means many. So notice carbon 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All of them have an alcohol group. All have an alcohol. That's why they call them polyalcohols. This is why sugar is polar and mixes with water. It is, remember when we were talking about polar and nonpolar, I said in really small molecules, if you only have one, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, or chlorine, then it's going to be unevenly shared, slightly polar. Same thing with the sugars. Every carbon has that alcohol group, which creates this slight charged nature to the sugar molecule, and this is why when you put sugar in coffee and stir it up, it completely dissolves. Okay, so these polyalcohols add to the polar nature of the molecule, even though it's bigger than a little molecule like water. It's bigger, but it's still going to be able to dissolve in water because of all those sort of distributed alcohol groups along the chain. Homework question, and I'll just mention this. Homework question asks about primary, secondary, and tertiary alcohols. A primary alcohol is listed first, then the secondary, then there's a tertiary. So just take a minute and look at those. A primary alcohol is defined as being an alcohol group connected to a carbon that only has one other carbon connected. So see here, there's only one. So you look kind of like when we were identifying functional groups. So a primary alcohol, if you look at the carbon the alcohol is attached to, there's only one other carbon. So notice the others are hydrogens. Secondary alcohols will have two carbons attached to the carbon of the alcohol. So that's where secondary comes in. So that one would be an alcohol like hanging off of the middle of a chain. Tertiary alcohols have three. Sugars actually have primary alcohols and secondary alcohols in the chain. So if we go back and look, what is carbon number 2? The alcohol here, would that be a primary, secondary, or tertiary alcohol? Secondary, right? So you look, see here's the carbon, and you say, oh, there's a carbon here and a carbon here. It has two carbons attached, so this would be a secondary alcohol. What about carbon 3, 4, and 5? They're all secondaries. Do you see that they all have a carbon above and below to the carbon they're attached to? So secondary, secondary, secondary. Now, how is the 6th one different? Carbon 6. If you look at the carbon that alcohol is attached to, how many carbons is it attached to? Only one, so it is a primary. Okay, primary alcohols are on the end of the chain. Secondaries would be like in the middle of a chain. And we don't really have a whole lot of tertiaries. But just so if it asks you a question about this on your homework, it's not a difficult question. Just remember, you look at the alcohol, look at the carbon it's connected to, and then just look to see how many carbons it has connected to it. Okay? So this one is a primary alcohol. Okay, so we have these aldehydes. You can also have sugars with ketones. Okay, so remember the ketone is a double bond oxygen, just like the aldehyde it has, but the aldehyde is going to have the double bond oxygen on the end of the chain. A ketone will always have the double bond oxygen on the second carbon. So on the chain, if you drew it in in the normal chain, like the one that we've been handing around, the aldehyde's on the carbon 1 at the very top. So the ketone, the double bond oxygen, would be on the second carbon. So it's always on either carbon 1 or 2 when looking at them. So here's an example of that. Okay, so looking at this one. So if you look at the left one, do you notice the left one looks different than glucose? See, all the alcohol groups are down the right side. Whereas when we were looking at glucose, it was a little different than that. That's still an aldohexose, because if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons, makes it a hexose. Aldehyde is on the end, so this is an aldohexose. But then looking at the second one, how many carbons in the chain? 5, so that makes this a pentose. And then finding that double bond oxygen on carbon 2 makes this a keto pentose. Okay? So again, just understanding what that's referring to. A ketone means the double bond oxygen's on carbon 2. An aldehyde, that double bond oxygen will be on the very end. 5 carbons is a pentose, 6 carbons is a hexose. And those are pretty much the only ones we really talk about. So I'm not going to worry with the other ones because they do have those ones listed, but I'm not going to ask you about them. All right, the big challenge. Sugars have lots of chiral carbons. So one of the reasons we talked about chiral carbons back in chapter 4 was because of sugars. Looking at glucose. How many chiral carbons does glucose have? There are 6 carbons. So remember, in doing chiral carbons, you've got to look at each one. And I told you before, first thing you can do, you can cross off anything that has a double bond, right? So any carbons with a double bond attached automatically get thrown out. So which carbon are you automatically Xing out? Carbon 1, right? So notice carbon 1 has a double bond oxygen, so it cannot be chiral. Then, rule number 2, you can throw out any carbons that have more than one hydrogen. So that allows you to X off what? carbon number 6, because carbon number 6 has 2 hydrogens directly connected to it. So looking back at this one, so this one's not chiral, and this one down here is not chiral because of those 2 oxygens. So I can't make mirror images that are not superimposable. But that leaves these other 4. When you look at the other 4, the ones with the little red asterisks on them, can you see that they are all chiral? To the left is a hydrogen, to the right is an alcohol, above is a single carbon, below is 4 carbons, right? So remember, it's everything above, below, left, and right that you're doing the comparison. So 2, 3, 4, and 5, they're all chiral. So glucose has 4 chiral carbons, which means that we can make this mirror image. It's not superimposable. In fact, we can make different sugars that are not identical to glucose just by switching one of those. So we could switch like carbon 2 or carbon 4 or carbon 5. We could switch the alcohol and the hydrogens and make partial mirror images. So they call those, they're another type of isomer. They're the diastereomers. Not as big and concerned about the naming for them. This just gives you an example how carbon 3 and carbon 4 are both chiral. So remember, when you're figuring out if something's chiral, look at everything above, below, left, and right to the carbon that you're examining. Don't just look at the one thing next to it. You got to look at the whole group, right, left, up, and down. And I'll always have them drawn out this way. Okay. Do you also notice that they have these funny little wedges? Okay. Do you notice that kind of looks different than how we usually draw them? Those wedges. So wedges mean what? That they're pointing forward, right? So remember, wedges are pointing forward, dashes are like pointing backwards from the board. Well, if you actually take this and look at it, these are specifically this glucose molecule. Carbon 1, we said, is not chiral, so we don't have to really examine, because remember, it can twist. The double bond oxygen just on this end. But if I look at carbon 2 and point, like wedges, point these towards you, the alcohol group is on which side? So the OH is over on the right. So see, in carbon 2, the alcohol group is on the right. Now, if I go down to carbon number 3 and stick it towards you, the alcohol group is on the left. Can you see that? So you really have to like pick this up and kind of twist it. As you examine each carbon, you always have to turn so that the 2 groups are pointing towards you. So carbon number 4, the alcohol group is, see, it's on the right. And then if I go to carbon 5, alcohol group is on the right. The last one, it doesn't matter, because the last one is the one that's not chiral, because it has this ability to just spin. So we wouldn't even look at that one. But these ones, the reason that these have these wedges is because this is truly glucose, with the orientation of the alcohol and hydrogens specifically listed in this way. So I'll send them around again. So if you want to look at it, pick it up. If you're going to look at each of these carbons, you want to like turn them, like hold on to the carbon and point the 2 groups at you, and you should see that they actually have that same. So we have carbon 2 is on the right, carbon 3 over on the left, carbon 4 over on the right, carbon 5 on the right. So in each one of them, that position is actually defined. If I flip them, if I change the alcohol and hydrogen position, then it's not glucose, because those are chiral carbons. So in fact, looking at, here's D-glucose, this first one, and like there's the wedge and dash projection. They'll also draw it in what they call a Fisher projection. So Fisher projections, where they have a little cross, remember that that's a carbon. Every little cross point is a carbon. It's almost like a weird skeletal structure, like a semi-skeletal structure. So this is the most abundant sugar found in nature, and it is exactly in this form. This is the only one of them that I expect you to be able to identify. And it's really not too hard to identify. You've got to remember glucose has the aldehyde on the end, that carbon 2 has the alcohol to the right, Carbon 3 has it to the left. Carbon 4 and 5 are to the right. So if you remember that this is right, left, right, right, that is the alcohol position on glucose. If I flip and I do the mirror image, can you see that the far right side looks like it's flipped? It's a mirror image. If I was putting a mirror up right here, notice that they're left, right, left, left for the alcohol position, so it's actually completely flipped. So that is the enantiomer, that is that isomer pair, that right and left-handed form of glucose that's not superimposable. So remember we did that in lab, like building molecules and trying to organize them that way? Take a couple. Pollen. So those are those enantiomer pairs, the non-superimposable right and left hands. Interestingly, D forms of all the sugars are what you find in nature. So remember cis and trans? We said that those double bonds, cis is what you find in nature. You don't find trans. Same thing here. You find D sugars are the most common sugars found in nature. Very rarely are there L, the opposite or mirror image forms found in nature. And the only way that I would say to think about it is enzymes have to interact with these molecules, and enzymes are sort of work on a lock and key mindset. So, like I have those keys, I have a big chain of keys that open different doors, lots of doors in this building, but there's only one key that opens this door. Okay, so I have to have that as a separate one. Then to open 7104, I have a separate key for that one because the teeth are really specific. Well, enzymes have evolved or developed so that they are specific to one kind of sugar. So having the mirror image would really just mean you'd have to have two enzymes. We'd have to have one enzyme and the mirror image enzyme to be able to interact with both. So that is why in nature you have evolved one specific type so that it's been, and one was more successful than the other, which is how it's ended up developing. But that's D-glucose. So that's really the only one that you should be able to identify. But look, glucose and galactose. Galactose is a component found in what? What does it sound like? Galactose sounds kind of like lactose, which is part of milk, right? Milk sugar. And in fact, galactose is one of the sugars found in milk sugar. Look at those two, glucose and galactose. What's different? Carbon number what? 4. Do you see carbon number 4? If you look at everything else, exactly the same. These are both aldohexoses. Carbon 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 doesn't matter because it's not chiral, but 2, 3, and 5, exactly the same. But carbon number 4, see the alcohol group is flipped? Galactose is a component found in milk sugar, and that's pretty much all you find it. You don't see it. If it comes into the body as a product in digestion, your liver converts it to glucose, takes it and actually swaps the alcohol and the hydrogen back. So glucose is your blood sugar. It is the most common sugar. And so even though there's only one difference, that is enough of a difference that changes how it's used. Looking at the last one, talose, what would you say is different there? Which do you think it looks more like? Talose looks more like glucose or galactose? It looks more like galactose, right? So if you look and do the comparison, it's exactly the same as galactose, except what? Carbon number 2. See here, these ones are flipped. So see how the hydrogen and the alcohol are flipped, but everything else is identical to galactose. Talose is not a common sugar. Galactose is found in milk sugar, but you don't find talose. It's so that even just a single structural position or orientation can create that difference. So then the topic of glucose. So glucose is really our first of the monosaccharides. We'll talk about fructose and galactose in a minute, but glucose, it is the most abundant monosaccharide found in nature. So glucose is found in fruits, vegetables, Glucose is part of grain sugar, milk sugar, table sugar. Glucose is what makes up starch. So glucose is also part of polysaccharides. Other terms, you may have heard glucose called dextrose. So like if you give a patient D5W, that's dextrose 5% in water. So D5W is given to be able to give a patient sugar. They just use dextrose because it's like the old term. It's the old kind of terminology compared to glucose. Glucose, so it's a aldohexose, C6H12O6. In your cells, your body would like to take glucose, combine it with 6 oxygens, and form 6 carbon dioxides and 6 H2Os and lots of ATP. So taking this 6 carbon molecule and breaking it down into single carbon molecules by combining it with oxygen, remember this is an oxidation reduction reaction, the glucose gets oxidized, the oxygen gets reduced. You're taking this big 6 carbon molecule and breaking it into lots of little molecules. And then by breaking bonds, you're releasing that energy. And then you trap that energy as ATP. The products are the key thing. Carbon dioxide. How do you get rid of carbon dioxide? All you have to do is what? How do you get rid of carbon dioxide? Come on now. Yeah. How do you get rid of carbon dioxide? How does your body get rid of CO2? Yeah. You don't, does that require a lot of effort? Does that require a lot of energy? No. Okay. So all you got to do is exhale. So this product is easily removed from the body. What about water? How do you get rid of water? It's already in the cell, right? You're already 2/3 water. So the water product, so the water that is formed in this reaction just becomes part of the cell's water. Breaking down glucose creates the easiest molecules to get rid of, carbon dioxide and water. Wastes don't build up. You don't end up with acids. You don't have excess nitrogen. Your liver doesn't have to come into play. Your kidneys don't work overtime. So that is why they say that glucose is your primary or preferred nutrient energy source. You can take this, break it down, make a lot of energy, and you can get rid of the waste molecules easily. It's not the case with fats and with proteins. So this is why the body is kind of like geared to really use glucose as its primary energy source. So you always have sugar in your blood. So the sugar that you eat, the carbohydrates that you eat, those get absorbed. They're now floating. Sugar dissolves in water, right? Sugars dissolve in water just fine. So it's constantly circulating. So they also refer to it as blood sugar. So most people, when they talk about blood sugar, they just have a number. But blood sugar, in fact, actually has units. But most of the time you say, my blood sugar is 80, my blood sugar is 60, my blood sugar is 250. Okay, so you just have these blood sugar numbers. But in fact, there's units. It's how much glucose is dissolved in the blood. It's X milligrams of glucose per deciliter of blood. And if you did the banana lab, remember the dipsticks? That was the unit for the dipstick results. So the numbers you had to use was milligrams per deciliter. We had to do all these unit conversions to figure it out. But that's really what those units come into play. Normal, this is a range. So your blood sugar does not have to be exactly a number. Your blood sugar is typically in a range, and it is considered normal as long as it stays between 60 and 110. If it goes below 60, what do they call that? What's the technical name? So less than 60 is called hypoglycemia, right? Because hypo means low. Okay, so hypoglycemia Anybody ever had hypoglycemia? How do you feel? You get really shaky, okay? It's like, like you're like, I'm feeling like I'm getting anxious or something's happening, but you may even like kind of feel this sort of, and it's because your brain runs on glucose exclusively. So if your blood sugar drops below 60, then your brain's like, what's going on? Not making a lot of energy, having problems sending nerve impulses, right? Like you've got to use lots of ATP to do all that. And so that kind of spacey sensation, like you're like, it's hard to concentrate, hard to think, all of that can be hypoglycemia or not enough sleep. There's a lot of reasons you might feel that way, but that could potentially be a reason. And people that have chronic hypoglycemia know that sensation. If it goes over 110, what do you call that? Hyperglycemia. So the term hyper is above. Glycemia is referring to that sugar in the blood. Okay? Hypo, think low. Hyper, think high. Diabetics have a challenge of fighting and balancing chronic hyperglycemia. They have issues with getting glucose that may be plentiful in the blood, but getting it into their cells. So there's a couple of possible reasons for that. This leads us to the discussion of diabetes mellitus. So diabetes mellitus affects about 110 million people in just the United States. 110 million people. It's a pretty big percentage. In fact, in healthcare, it accounts for billions of dollars worth of healthcare in the United States every year because of health issues that diabetics end up having. There's two types of diabetes. They split them into type 1 and type 2. Type 1 they call insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus. The other they call non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. So we'll split them up. I will tell you that type 1, the first one we'll talk about, that is only 10% of this number. So there's 110 million. So we'll roughly say about 10 million of those are type 1 diabetics. So only 10% of all of those are type 1. The 90%, the 100 million, those are the type 2. Now, whether you're taken care of or looking at going into vet tech versus dental hygiene versus nursing, these are going to be probably 1 out of 3 patients that you take care of. In fact, I had a vet tech student who's a vet tech right now. She's just trying to get her certification. And she said in the last week, they'd actually tested 4 dogs for diabetes. Had to go through the whole process of the sugar tolerance tests. So it's not like if you're a dental hygienist, when you're cleaning someone's teeth, if they're a diabetic, that can be a challenge because of poor circulation, poor healing issues. So it doesn't just like affect the one patient that ends up in the hospital. You may end up having patients that have lots of like these other issues that are really kind of like made worse because of diabetes. So in type 1, so first type 1, when it develops, typically, not every single time, but the majority of type 1 diabetics, they start to show at puberty. So somewhere between 10 and 17, because in that period of time, you're growing. So you are going through those growth spurts, which means that your cells are really active. The cells are growing, cells are dividing, growth hormone is triggering all this energy demand. Now, if you can't get sugar into your cells, but you need this high energy demand, then you have to use some other method to try and generate energy. So that is usually during, even if a child doesn't have a functioning pancreas during childhood, you usually don't start seeing dramatic changes until they start to grow. So that rapid growth period is oftentimes when this shows itself or displays. So here's normal. So this is what should happen, okay? So normally you eat, when you eat, whether you eat bread, cereal, rice, potatoes, pasta, okay? Or if you have a candy bar, Or if you have a frappe thing, like the the culottes and all of those things that have like mac amounts of sugar in them, okay? If you eat any kind of carbohydrate, starches have to get digested. Simple sugars get very little digestion required. They get absorbed. So any carbohydrates, as they get absorbed, blood sugar goes up. When your blood sugar goes over 110, because remember that's the range, 60 to 110, when blood sugar goes over 110, so it starts to go up, when it hits that 120, your pancreas starts to secrete insulin. And insulin is the signal to your cells to open up channels and pull glucose into the cell. So insulin gets secreted, so you eat, sugar goes up, insulin secretion till it comes back down below 110, and then your pancreas stops secreting until you eat again, right? So then you eat again later, same exact thing. So sugar goes up, the pancreas secretes insulin, brings that sugar back down. So insulin is kind of like a key. It is a signal to your body cells that there's sugar in the blood. If you don't have insulin, your body cells don't have anything to open the channel. They have no idea there's sugar in the blood. And instead, the cells, somebody that's diabetic, when they eat, they end up with hyperglycemia. So the blood sugar goes above 110, no insulin. Goes to 150, no insulin. Goes to 200, no insulin. So as long as sugar is getting absorbed from your diet, your blood sugar is going to go through the roof. So any CNAs, anybody had an experience with a high blood sugar? What's the highest you've ever had?
I actually have a patient. He goes to dialysis every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. His normal range for blood pressure is
Or blood sugar.
Oh, blood sugar.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, no, his blood sugar's fine. I don't know why. I thought blood.
Yeah, well, is he diabetic?
No, but I have had a few that are like I've seen it up into the 400s.
Mm-hmm. What have you seen?
It was like I think it was 382.
380. Okay.
I've seen one as low as 19.
Yes.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like super low hypoglycemia. That's like a huge challenge. That can happen if a diabetic takes too much insulin. So it's like it's this back and forth.
I've seen more than it's high.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a senior, but my grandma, she's a diabetic. She
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really understand much, but before she moved in with my parents, where my parents could monitor and help with her nutrition, her highest I think was like 420.
420. I've had nursing students that like work in ERs, work in doctors' offices that have had people come in and had blood sugars of 800.
Good Lord.
Mm-hmm. So 60 to 110 is normal. So this person comes in with a blood sugar 10 times higher than it should be. So think about like a glass and you put a tablespoon of sugar, then add 10 more tablespoons of sugar, stirring it up. What starts to happen to the thickness of that liquid?
It's almost solid.
Uh-huh. It starts becoming like syrup, right? Maple syrup and honey, those are concentrated sugar solutions. So, like trying to get honey off of the spoon or trying to squeeze it out of the little jar. Maple syrup, same thing, pancake syrup, it's got a lot of sugar in it. That's what happens to their blood. Okay? It's not the high blood, so hyperglycemia is like person that's not been diagnosed comes in, they check this blood sugar, they're like, because now your blood's super, super thick. Your heart is trying to pump syrup instead of water because your blood is pretty thin, right? The blood flows easily. Its density is pretty close to water. It's a little more dense, but not a lot. When you start to dump lots and lots of sugar, it's making it thick. So what is that going to do in terms of your heart's effort? Goes up, right? Your heart's like, trying to squeeze, just like you trying to squeeze syrup out of the maple syrup container. So it's harder to get it to move. So the blood pressure, since it doesn't want to flow, blood pressure goes up. People that have hyperglycemia have hypertension. They have heart stress, and that can lead to, when you have those numbers in the 800s, you worry about stroke and heart attack. So that pressure can get so great that it could actually blow a blood vessel. Okay?
That's one of the reasons that my grandma moved in with my parents because she had a stroke from how bad her diabetes was.
Yep. So that is, and that is like untreated, unmonitored diabetes. That's what ends up happening. Your blood literally gets too thick. It cannot flow.
You swell up like a balloon too.
Mm-hmm.
What causes people to lose weight?
Okay, so this hyperglycemia could create a life-threatening condition, a heart attack or stroke. Most people, what ends up happening is that their cells, because there's no insulin, the cells are like, we're starving. There's no sugar coming in. There's no insulin to open the gate. So the blood sugar is really high outside of the cells, but the cells still can't get that sugar. So they go to the other two nutrients. So remember I told you that glucose is wonderful because you make carbon dioxide and water. You go, and you get rid of the waste molecules of sugar metabolism. Not so with fats and proteins. When you burn fats, the byproducts are acids. So some of it's fine, but high amounts, what happens with a patient with hyperglycemia and is doing a lot of fat burning, that acid generation can build up in the blood and actually end up lowering the balance of the pH. So it can cause what's called ketoacidosis. So that is when the blood's pH goes down. And if you've done fluid and electrolytes, then you know that decrease in blood pH can shut down your nervous system. So this is why patients that have high sugar and they have a lot of fat metabolism going on, then they're tired, lethargic. They may actually lose consciousness. They can go into a diabetic coma. And if that is not remedied, that can cause irreversible brain damage. So that can like leave you in a coma. Yeah, so it's like, well, it'll be fine. I'll be okay tomorrow. No, okay? Type 1 diabetes has to be treated or it's going to be fatal. Something is going to happen down the road. The problem, so a patient comes in with really high blood sugar, they give them insulin. They give them insulin and then they start titrating. So what you do is you give them sugar and you give them insulin and monitor how does their blood sugar change. How much insulin do you need to keep your blood sugar between 60 and 110? So they have to monitor it. So I don't know, there is this, I think she's a gymnast. She's a gymnast that is a type 1 diabetic. And she actually has like the monitoring system. So you may have actually seen that on somebody if they got a short sleeve shirt. Commonplace that they'll have them. You can put them here as well. But the monitoring system actually, every time that you can use your phone, it's like Bluetooth to it, which is amazing. So you can actually check your blood sugar. Okay. So you just take it. All it does is just take a tiny sampling of blood every time you activate it, and it monitors your blood sugar to keep it between 60 and 110. So if you take it and your blood sugar is 150, then you know you need to take insulin. If you take it and your blood sugar is 40, then you know you need to eat something. So that's a way for them, for a diabetic, to try and maintain it in a range. Some people are what they call brittle diabetics. Brittle diabetics have a very difficult time keeping it in that range. So we had a friend that he came over and he started getting kind of spacey acting, checked his blood sugar, it was only 30. So then we went and we ate, and then 6 hours later, his blood sugar was over 200. And he was like, I didn't bring any insulin with me. I got to go home. Okay. So this isn't a normal day. And so it's this constant thing. So keeping it regulated is important because this hyperglycemia is really the one that ends up leading to these long-term issues like losing limbs. Hyperglycemia makes your blood really thick. When your blood is really thick, it does not flow well. That puts more stress on your heart. So now you have an increased risk of heart disease. You can end up having congestive heart failure because of it, because your heart has been working so hard to pump this really thick blood. You can end up with heart attack, stroke. Those are all risks. When you get further away from the heart, the less pressure, right? So the blood vessels right outside of your heart, like the aorta and the really big arteries, there's plenty of pressure, and that typically will even push your thick blood. But when you get down into the capillaries, so these are the real thin blood vessels that surround your organs, they surround your muscles, like all the way down in your hands and your feet. When you're this far, there's less pressure here. So thick blood, if there's nothing pushing it, what will thick blood do? Is it going to flow? No. There's not enough push to keep blood flowing. That's when you start having capillary damage. Capillary damage then means that you're not getting good blood flow to all the cells in that area. So your nerves begin to shut down. So that's called neuropathy. Neuropathy, so any kind of pathy is like death of or damage to. So that's like damage to nerves. So neuropathies, does your grandma have neuropathy? How does she describe her feet?
She has trouble feeling her feet. Like if she touches it, she doesn't.
Yeah, like your feet go numb, fingers go numb. Okay, some people have neuropathy pain. You know how has your leg ever fallen asleep? And when it wakes back up, you get the pins and needles. Some people get permanent pins and needle sensations. So it feels like their feet are like tingly. Anytime they're walking anything, they get like that pins and needles. And it's all because these nerves are not getting circulation. So if the nerves aren't getting circulation, then they're like half asleep, half awake kind of thing. Over time, they just die back. So you start to lose that feeling completely. So now you have numb feet and you get a cut on your foot and you have poor circulation. That sets up a big storm for what? Infection, right? Because one, you may not even know you have a cut on your foot because you don't feel it, right? So if you step on something and you get a cut on your foot, you're like, oh my God, like staggering around, you would clean it, keep the Neosporin on it, and you have good blood flow. So the repair occurs rapidly. With diabetes, you can cut your foot and that sore will stay for months.
I had a patient like that, and it was a building that I had worked at, and she had diabetes, and she had gotten the podiatrist to do her toes, and they nicked her, and no one knew about it.
And she didn't feel it.
She wasn't getting the proper care that she was, and she, like at night, she would get these screaming pains, like she would scream and cry all night long. And so they finally got someone to come check it out. They went in there and looked, and it hadn't healed, and she had maggots on her.
Yep. So you end up with gangrene. You end up with literally toes rotting off, falling off. The big concern though is that if that infection enters the bloodstream, that's sepsis, and sepsis can cause organ failure. So sepsis can shut down your liver, it can shut down your kidneys. So that can end up being like a fatal thing. So
if they're not because you said that some people don't have it where it's completely dead, it's just it's not as strong of blood flow there. Is there any way to make the blood flow stronger to your
this is the big thing right here. Controlling hyperglycemia. If you don't want those chronic things to happen, because this doesn't usually happen overnight. So the lady with diabetes, with the maggots, that did not evolve last week I had great circulation and now this week I'm in this status. No, this is something that has developed over close to a decade, right?
No way to reverse it.
No, you can't open back capillaries that are shut down. And so that's the unfortunate. So this is where hyperglycemia is really important, managing and making sure that you keep your blood sugar below that 110, not having periods of 200, 300, 400, because that thick blood shuts down capillary beds and they're not going to grow back because they just become scar tissue. Other parts, though, keeping in mind, we're not just talking about cardiovascular, even though these are caused by that cardiovascular issue. Your blood vessels that are behind your retinas that supply the sensory receptors for vision are extremely thin and delicate. Thick blood doesn't flow through really tiny vessels very well. And there are many people that are actually diagnosed as diabetic by their optometrist. So they go to their eye doctor for their eye appointment. And I don't know if you've ever seen, my eye doctor, takes a picture of the back of my eye so you can see, the whole big red pink. Someone with diabetes that has had lots of hyperglycemic issues that haven't been managed well will have gray spots.
I was born cataracts.
Born with them.
Yeah.
But that's, then the optician's oh, are you a diabetic? No. You need to go to see your doctor because that is a sign you can end up with blindness. You can lose complete vision because of damage to the capillary beds that supply the sensory neurons for vision. Kidney failure. A lot of diabetics end up having to go to dialysis. And this is because the filters in your kidneys are also thin, delicate blood vessels in those little glomeruli. So they filter out wastes, But if the blood is really thick flowing through those filters will blow. And if they blow, they shut down and convert to scar tissue. And so what you start to see is people that have less and less kidney filtration, and then they may require dialysis. So like all of that ends up being this kind of chronic thing that people are dealing with. And a reason that you really want to try for a type 1 diabetic needs to monitor their blood sugar, take insulin when required, and make sure that they eat if their blood sugar goes below 60, because there's like that range. You don't want it to if you take too much insulin, your blood sugar goes too low. If you don't take enough insulin, your blood sugar goes too high. So there's a lot of research that's being done on pancreatic cell transplants, having kind of like a diabetes, an insulin pump, like implanted. Some people that are those brittle diabetics have a hard time regulating. They actually have an insulin monitor and they actually have an insulin pump. So they get whichever. Okay. So the only thing they've got to do is like monitor it, give themselves the insulin, and they can do it like on their phone, literally. So that really helps a lot, especially if they have a hard time balancing it. But now I told you this is roughly like 10 million people in the United States. They have to take insulin or all of these things end up becoming life-threatening. The 90%.
As far as her question earlier, my grandma, we've noticed if we can get her eating semi well enough and get her motivated to walk, then she'll start getting a little bit of feeling back in her legs just from the walking.
The walking is probably increasing circulation. So that's probably improving that sensation.
Yeah, and they've gotten her regulated when she eats right and does that. She'll be around 200 is her normal, maybe even as low as 160, but that's her
high normal. And so a lot of people that are type 2 diabetics, like their blood sugar tends to be just under 200. And if that goes down to 110, they feel hypoglycemic. They get really shaky, really spacey, like their body has adjusted to having this high sugar level. The problem is it's still doing the damage. You're still in this thicker blood consistency. And so that's the big challenge is like, you feel okay right now, but then long term, what is that going to do in terms of heart function, in terms of capillary health, kidney function and such? Type 2 though, this is 90%. 90% of diabetics in the United States are type 2 diabetics. These typically, although not all the time, but typically type 1 is like juvenile. It comes on like in childhood and at puberty. Type 2, you usually see it develop in adulthood. So we're talking 40s, 50s, 60s is when you begin to see this. This can be because of less insulin. So your pancreas still makes some insulin, just not as much as it used to. So you might need some help with that type of thing. Or the insulin that you do make doesn't work as well as it should. And so this little diagram over here is kind of shows like how insulin is really this key. So if you have a body cell, we'll just say these are generic little round body cells. It could be a muscle cell, it could be skin cells, it could be any organ cells. But if you have a body cell, all body cells except for your brain, because your brain doesn't need insulin, your brain's going to get sugar, which is why you feel terrible when you don't have sugar because it needs it. But body cells, most body cells, they have a receptor. And the receptor, I think of it as like a lock. There's a lock on the door. So the shape of that receptor, insulin binds to it, and that's the signal to open the door and allow glucose to come in. So glucose then streams into the cells, and that brings your blood sugar back to normal. And once insulin stops being secreted, then that door shuts. So cells get glucose, can use that glucose for energy. What they find in type 2, there's less receptors. So if there's less receptors, see the little receptor, which is like, looks like the little Y kind of sticking off the surface of the cell. If there's no receptor, what's that going to do? It's literally like you took the key off the door. So you have a glucose door, but there's no key. So insulin can't open it. So they find this happens in correlation with weight. Not all type 2 diabetics are overweight. Being overweight does not mean you're going to be a type 2 diabetic. But being overweight increases the odds, put you at high risk for developing type 2 diabetes, because if the weight is above normal, then the body cells can start pulling receptors for insulin off of body cells, which then means the insulin you make doesn't do anything. So they still then end up in periods of hyperglycemia. The body really is trying to shift to fat burning. So if you have a high body fat percentage, then the body is trying to burn that body fat instead of glucose. And so that's part of the thought, is what your body's trying to do is just shift to fat burning. I always just think of bears, right? So like bears, they like gorge themselves and get really big and fatty and chubby before the winter. Then they go hibernate. And while they're hibernating, they actually burn that body fat. So it's sort of the same thing. The body's mindset's like, well, we've got a high percent of fat. Let's shift and burn more body fat instead. But that would work if you didn't have any other carbohydrates coming in. So this person still eating carbohydrates, and maybe not even in excess, but the carbohydrates are not getting absorbed into the blood. So now they start to have the hyperglycemia. So they don't typically have like the issues of the strokes, the heart attacks, like having the immediate, but they have this chronic hyperglycemia that begins to develop and cause all these health problems.
So like when you said like the bear when they hibernate, when they go to sleep and everything during the winter, and let's say they don't eat enough for the winter, will that cause them like to wake up or like lose them an extra amount of body weight than they should?
When they like, if you've ever like, you can like Google pictures of like some of the grizzly bears before and after winters. They go in, they're like huge chubby looking things, and they come out and they're like furs hanging off of them. They're like skeletal looking things. And all they do then is like, they come out real mean and they like eat as much as possible. Like that's when you don't want to be in the woods. But that's, so if they don't eat enough, they'll just starve. They'll never come out of their den. They'll die.
Oh, so they won't like wake up and go get food?
No, in the middle of the winter? Nope. So that's like, that is why there's like this natural like urge for them to just like eat absolutely as much as they can. Like, I mean, they just like stand in those rivers and eat the salmon, like whole salmon, just nomming and like as much as possible. And they just sit in the blueberry patch, just like throwing it back, like until they're literally like waddling. They're so fat because they need that fat, because in the wintertime they hibernate. Their blood pressure goes down, heart rate goes down. They sleep, they don't come out. They don't come out until it starts to warm up. There's like this natural rhythm that they have. And if they don't eat enough, then they won't survive. And a lot of them, mamas have cubs during the winter too. And so like, not only do they have to have enough for them, they have to have enough for the babies that they birth in their little dens during the winter. So it's pretty rough. It's not an easy thing being a grizzly bear. But so for us though, we don't stop eating. Right? So we don't stop eating. Like a bear can do this fat burning and survive, but we don't stop eating. So that means that we're going to have these periods of more than 110 in terms of blood sugar. 3 more minutes. And so now you still have this risk of heart disease, hypertension, poor capillary circulation, poor healing. You can still end up with kidney damage. Blindness can still become an issue. So treatment for this, though, is a little different than what it is for type 1. So they may need to put you on meds to help improve the connection of insulin with the receptors you do have. So that's like metformin helps to do that. There's also other medications. There's some medications that help to actually flush excess sugar out through the kidneys. So bring your blood sugar down by flushing blood sugar in urine. A lot of side effects to those things, though. People that take metformin, common sort of commentary with that is, I feel really crappy. I don't feel good when I take it. It just makes me feel bad. People that take the ones that flush sugar have a very high risk of developing some really nasty infections in the urinary tract. No. Like literally like a whole perineal infection. Yes. And like if you're not active and you don't go to the doctor all the time about all of this, then but when they notice it, it's like already started to become necrotic.
So why do they feel so bad when they're on metformin?
I don't know if it's just the side effect. People have like cramps, people have like muscle cramps, they have like GI issues. I mean, it's a medication, but it is one that they've used a long time just trying to like improve that insulin effect. But they have found if you change two things, the loss of even 10% of body weight can actually reduce your need for the medications. So decreasing carbohydrates, because if you're not ingesting sugars and starches, then you're not going to be dumping a lot of sugar into the blood. So that means your blood sugar is not going to like spike. So that means you got to cut out like the sweets, and you got to reduce some of those starchy types of foods, and then exercise. So like you said, like when your grandmother exercises, moving around, exercise will help to decrease body fat. And then loss of body fat actually has shown those receptors come back. So people that were on diabetic medications that are type 2, that lose even sometimes as little as 10, 15 pounds, actually help to they start to regulate their own blood sugar better. Their insulin works better. The last thing is this is really the way that they check now. When you go to the doctors and you get a checkup, one thing that they'll test is what they call A1C. What A1C does is it actually measures the amount of sugar that has been in your blood over 3 months, because it measures the amount of blood sugar that's in your red blood cells. Your red blood cells last about 120 days. If that red blood cell was made and you were hyperglycemic, there will be more sugar in that red blood cell. So by taking a blood sampling and measuring it by A1C, they're really seeing like a average. So it's not just like, I just ate salads for 3 days, then went to the doctors and they were like, your blood sugar is only 80, but your A1C is 6.7. So this, you can't really cheat, right? Unless you eat really well for 3 months before you go to the doctor. But I mean, if you're going to do that, you might as well just eat right. Okay. So normal A1C, anything below 5.7. Most people are in the 4 and lower 5s. Most people are 4.5, 4.8, 5.2. Those are fine. Anything over 5.7 to 6.4, now they call that pre-diabetic, because that means you've had periods of this. You have had periods of hyperglycemia. In the last 3 months, you have had periods where your blood sugar has been above 110 for a while. That's like a warning sign. If it goes over 6.4, then you are technically considered a diabetic. And they're going to talk about treatment that includes medications. Okay, so it's really like helps because it gives you an idea, and it's a good like pre-diabetic way of identifying somebody in that issue. But this is really like, of all of them, heart disease, diabetes, strokes, cancer, those are pretty much all the big healthcare things, whether you're taking care of 4-legged animals or 2-legged people. That is really this is a major health issue that you will deal with if you're in healthcare. Okay? All right, I will quit there. We will finish the sugar material on Thursday.